Sorry, man. Let me clear my throat first. Okay, everything ready? Set to go? Ready? Okay. Paris during the Second World War was a ghost city, held by the strict German regime which imposed on them anything that wasn't freedom. The city's only escape from harsh reality was cinema, and even then it was restricted to German films, either propaganda or imitation of famous Hollywood genres. Only a handful of 200-odd French films occupy slots in France's theaters, and these were films that were made before the war. To a generation of cinephiles who had experienced the rich variety in cinematic culture before the war, this added to their sense of loss as a consequence of war. This experience of loss led them to prize freedom of expression and truth of representation above all else, values which would become central to their work. When France was liberated from German occupation and the banning of American cinema was lifted, cinema was on the move. It became as popular as ever. Film theories like Andre Bazin and Alexander Astruc emerged with a newfound approach to cinema, that films are a form of art and one that deserves serious analysis. Bazin's was a great desire for self-expression, open communication, and understanding. Bazin's interest was in the language of film, favoring the discussion of form over content. Another theorist, Alexander Astruc, pushed for the idea that cinema, like literature, to become a more personal form, and thus bring forth the idea that the camera represents a pen with which a director uses to create his artwork, like literature, where it is as easy to put a masterpiece on paper. In a way, the camera becomes an extension of the artist. That comparison brought forth the development of the author theory, which was something of a manifesto for the new wave generation that was on the horizon. The author theory holds that a film should reflect upon the director's personal creative vision. Hence the title author of the story is given to the director. The author is the one responsible for his own individual style, which is either creative or personal, sometimes both. And this happens as a recurring theme in his movies, whereby his creative voice is as distinct as the story itself and is brought from one of his movies to the next, like for example Alfred Hitchcock's brief cameo role in every one of his movies, and Quentin Tarantino's displacement of scenes or parts of the movie, likening it to a jigsaw puzzle where we piece them together, which is a trademark of these directors. All around there were film reviews and journals. Some of the earliest was Les Revues du Cinéma and Les Grands Français, which became a platform for influential writers like Andre Bazin, from which he preached love in cinema and developed his theories. In the film magazines and journals, it increased awareness on cinema techniques, and American as well as European cinema were discussed. It would have a lasting effect on the new wave filmmakers. Avid readers of film journals and magazines now began setting up film clubs all over France. One name to note was Henri Langlois' Cinématique Française, which first opened in 1948. It garnered popularity and became a central figure for serious film enthusiasts. Langlois believed that the cinematic was a place to study films and really understand what the audiences are seeing. He would hold screenings very often, and it is said he would sometimes show foreign films without translation or silent films without music to focus the attention of the audience to the techniques behind what they were watching. And it was at his cinematic that many of the important directors of the new wave first met, like François Truffaut and Jean-Luc Godard, among others. The cinematic wasn't the only one that influenced the movement. One of the most important and popular film journals of all appeared in 1951, called Les Cahiers du Cinéma. It was in this journal that the film analysts of the French New Wave first had their voices heard and their theories brought to the surface. At first, the young cinephiles like Rohmer, Truffaut, Godard, Rivet, and Chabrol were only allowed a small column, but gained more and more attention as their status rose accordingly. These young writers had a similar disdain for the mainstream traditions of French cinema at the time. Things like unimaginative, old-fashioned studio filming were denounced, and was labeled as wasn't visual enough. But the criticism from these young writers wasn't unfounded. In fact, when their column space became larger, they used it as an opportunity to promote their favorite directors within the review and develop their theories. As a result, their theories provide a radical new way of looking at cinema. Filmmakers' works were discussed with accuracy and depth. It was either admired or criticized. Their criticisms, of course, didn't get off the hook. Some felt it to be too extreme, leading to a feeling of hatred. It resulted as a kind of warfare between the young writers and the old guard of French cinema. The young critics of Cahiers du Cinéma wasn't content with just critiquing, and after a while decided that they would explore their own theories by directing their own films. Thus, they ventured into short films, raising money any way they could along the way. These short films validated their stand, their new way of seeing cinema, and their revolutionary film techniques. Short films were important in the New Wave movement and ultimately helped the director of the New Wave propel to an increasingly high standards and prepared them for their next big step, feature films. Roger Vadim and Jean-Pierre Melville were considered the first to create New Wave feature films. Both were inspiring figures to young directors hoping to make their first film on their own terms. In 1959, Truffaut created the film that propelled the rising New Wave movement to the world stage at the 1959 Cannes Film Festival, The 400 Blows. It caused such a storm and turned him and his actors into overnight superstars. Alain René's Hiroshima Mon Amour, which entered the festival that same year, which also was a hype and was acclaimed for its originality and created an international storm. Another film, Breathless by Jean-Luc Godard, with its distinctly new wave traits, shocked and awed audiences worldwide and stamped the French New Wave's arrival in the international stage and proved that this wasn't a one-off phenomenon. Many new movements have popped up around the world today. The Japanese New Baru Bagu and the Indian parallel cinema are one of the few distinguished new wave movements after France. What's also interesting is that there was a period of time where Hollywood adopted the new wave movement, called New Hollywood. New wave movement around the world still exists today, but its golden period was decades ago. Techniques of the new wave movement have become a staple for films today, and what was radical for the time are now modern vehicles for effective storytelling. Films like Les Fabuleux, Destin les Amélie Poulain, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, Annie Hall, and Pulp Fiction are just a few which borrowed techniques from the French New Wave. Movies since then evolved from characters revolving around the world to the world that revolved around the characters. Films became more expressionistic, choosing to show what and how the characters feel, rather than literally showing it, an advent that has been lost since German Expressionism. Audiences were left to interpret. The camera reinvented itself as a personal medium and was liberated with movements and spontaneity of actions within the frame, something which big studios with their artificial sets and lighting couldn't allow. But most importantly was the deep underlying meanings which gave soul to the films of the New Wave. What do you think was the moral message of the 400 Blows? It was significant to Truffaut when he made it. Why? What was Breathless mocking? Alternatively, what was it praising? Everything that was in the movie framing had to be questioned. If you understood the trails of details